For the 75-year history since the birth of the country, Israelis unified in the face of external threats. The war prompted by Israel's declaration of independence in 1948, the Six-Day War in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Israel is a remarkably diverse country. Jews from various diaspora communities around the world, Druze, Muslim and Christian Arabs, Circassians and more, call this land home. Despite the fervent and ever-present ethnic and religious tensions, physical threats from its immediate neighborhood and further afield helped keep the lid on the Jewish state's deep differences and lowered simmering tensions. That may be beginning to change. One thing is certain, the past 7 months have ignited the country in a way its enemies could never imagine. In January, 2 months after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu won his 6th term in office, his coalition introduced a set of laws intended to remake Israel's judicial system by removing vast powers from the Supreme Court. Hundreds of thousands of people in this nation of around 9 million immediately took to the streets to protest, convinced that the plan was a blueprint for unfettered majority rule, a mockery of the delicate system of checks and balances and maybe even outright dictatorship. This internal disagreement now threatens to irrevocably rip apart Israel's social fabric. The streets are on fire, parts of the military are revolting, and there's no extinguisher in sight. Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, officially declares the state's independence in a modest white building on Tel Aviv's leafy Rothschild Boulevard. The Declaration of Independence called for a constitution to be established no later than October 1, 1948, less than 5 months after Ben-Gurion brought the state into being. That deadline came and went. 75 years have passed and Israel is still without a constitution. Ben-Gurion and his 17 successors as Prime Minister could not have predicted that the fateful decision to kick the constitutional can down the road has planted the seeds for Israel's current crisis. The absence of a constitution means that the rights of Israeli citizens, the balance of power and the rule of law are in flux and in question. There is no central legal doctrine enshrining these democratic tenets. Instead, basic laws form the basis of Israel's quasi-constitution. Such laws carry additional weight and act as the widely understood rules of the game. They set the norms around the army, the government, the judiciary, and civil rights and guarantees. Aside from these laws, which can be passed and amended by a simple majority, the Supreme Court is the only institutional check on unrestrained majority rule. Over the past 8 months, Israelis have been wrestling over their country's judicial system and broader national identity, as Prime Minister Netanyahu's far right-wing coalition pushes to change the rules of the game. It all began in January, when Justice Minister Yariv Levin gave a primetime address unveiling the government's suite of dramatic proposals. Chief among them, a law to allow a simple 61-seat majority in the 120-seat Knesset to overrule any Supreme Court decision. Economists warned that the effort would harm foreign investment and imperil the start-up nation's high-tech sector, its money-making engine and growth driver. Legal experts cautioned that the proposed changes would erode Israeli democracy, turning the country into a Middle Eastern Hungary or Poland. Israel's closest allies, including the United States and several European governments, voiced concerns and privately advised that any changes be made with a broad national consensus. Sunday evening, March 26, 2023. A turning point in Israel's history. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant gave a public speech calling for the government to halt its unilateral overhaul and to enter negotiations with the opposition.
In recent days and weeks, during conversations and discussions behind the scenes, I presented the security situation to our various parties. I asked, reasoned, and said that at this time, the process must be stopped, so that we may sit and talk. But now, I declare loudly and publicly, for the sake of Israel's security, for the sake of our sons and daughters, the legislative process should be stopped in order to enable the nation of Israel to celebrate Passover and Independence Day together, and to mourn together on Memorial Day and Holocaust Remembrance Day. These are holy days for us.
Hours later, Prime Minister Netanyahu fired Gallant, shaking the country and prompting hundreds of thousands of Israelis to spontaneously hit the streets. Protests lasted until dawn, as the streets rocked with demonstrators, many of whom voted for the Prime Minister's party, waving Israeli flags and shouting, "Shame!" and "Democracy!" The dam appeared to have broken. Prominent right-wing voices began calling for compromise. Members of the ruling party tweeted cautious support of stopping the overhaul and entering negotiations with the opposition parties. Wind the clock forward to August, the coalition torpedoes negotiations in June, and weeks later resumed their unilateral drive. This time, they wouldn't try to ram through the whole package at once, instead electing for a salami slicing strategy of passing each piece one by one. At the end of July, despite the continuing protests, business strikes, pressure from foreign leaders, and threats of military reservists, the government passed the first law, robbing the court of its ability to make legal rulings on the basis of reasonableness. All of this turmoil is happening during a bloody 2023, terrorist attacks on a weekly basis, including a shooting at a cafe on Tel Aviv's central Dizengoff Street, IDF raids deep into the West Bank. Many of the most hardline elements of the government were partially elected on promises to secure the country, to root out terror with an iron fist. But now, the government is relentlessly pursuing its judicial overhaul as priority number one. Hezbollah, the Iran-backed terrorist group that holds court in Lebanon, appears encouraged by the internal rifts. After the coalition passed the first law in July, Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah beamed that this day sets the country on a path toward disappearance. Over the past few months, the group has been poking Israel's security apparatus, testing the northern border by building tents in disputed regions and giving the green light for Palestinian groups operating in southern Lebanon to send rockets towards towns across the border in Israel. In the spring, Hezbollah operatives erected 2 tents across the Blue Line near Mount Dov, a disputed area in the region of the Golan Heights under Israel's control. A few months later, groups operating in southern Lebanon fired 2 anti-tank weapons at Gajar, an Alawite Arab village in Israel's portion of the Golan Heights. The group has also attempted more direct challenges to Israeli security. In March, as the protests against the judicial overhaul were reaching a fever pitch, a Hezbollah-linked operative made his way deep into Israeli territory. He detonated an IED and traveled further south before authorities shot and killed the man. As a result, the odds of a full-blown conflict between Israel and Hezbollah are at their highest point since the devastating 2006 war. Nothing unifies Israelis like an external foe, but the country has never experienced this level of internal polarization, this depth of discord. It remains to be seen whether Hezbollah is itching for war or simply testing the choppy waters and Israel's perceived vulnerability. One thing is certain: Hezbollah and other actors feel emboldened by the scenes of Israelis fighting Israelis. All it takes is one miscalculation, and the region will be engulfed by flames and bloodshed. The judicial overhaul saga is also impacting Israel's international relationships, including its closest ally, the United States. US President Joe Biden has yet to formally invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington. Israeli President Isaac Herzog went on a state visit in July. This snub is widely believed to be because of the Israeli government's dogged unilateral pursuit and broader illiberal trajectory. The Biden administration has consistently urged any wide-ranging changes take place by consensus. It called the passage of the first slice of the overhaul in July unfortunate, a rare public rebuke of one of Washington's closest partners. The coming months in Israel will be pivotal for the country's cohesion, economy, foreign relations, national identity, and national security. The Knesset is on summer recess, and the Jewish high holidays are in September. Around mid-October, the government will either bulldoze the rest of its overhaul or seek to temper the flames. A potential constitutional crisis looms just over the horizon. The Supreme Court will convene a full 15-member panel to hear petitions against the recently passed reasonableness law on September 12th. Should the justices strike down the very law designed to strip some of its power, the country would face the democratic equivalent of an abyss. Does the government heed the top court's decision? In interviews in recent weeks, Prime Minister Netanyahu has refused to commit to doing so. No matter what happens in the cramped Knesset plenum or how the votes are tallied, Israel will be forever changed by this episode. The electorate is deeply polarized. Supporters of the coalition see a chance to right historic wrongs perpetrated by the left-wing elite that founded the country. The Israeli center has been energized by weekly street protests where multi-generational families wave Israeli flags and snap selfies to fight what they view as an anti-democratic power grab. Recent polls show less than a third of the country supports the current overhaul and that the opposition would easily form a government in the next elections. Some observers warn of civil war. Others see an opportunity to finally make good on Ben-Gurion's promise to draft a constitution. Opposition. Politicians and protest leaders say they are trying to prevent Hungary on the Mediterranean. The coalition promises to properly rebalance the unelected judiciary and the elected government. Hezbollah, Hamas and Iran are gleeful. Is months of feverish debate and incitement enough to accomplish what Israel's myriad enemies have failed to do over the decades? Can societal rifts widen so far that national cohesion becomes impossible? Will Israelis rediscover their common bond and their shared past to ensure a secure future? Time will tell. For now, the sides seem likely to entrench in their respective corners, steeling for a battle to come, against themselves or together against a common enemy. This has been another episode of Meridian Mindset. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment down below. We also just launched a new Twitter account, so please give us a follow at Meridian Mindset and check out our other socials as well.